Hey folks, Steve here with an End of Empire video. This is sort of a post-mortem. I tend to do these post-mortem videos when I am done playing a big campaign scenario for a game that I cover on the channel. It just sort of, the previous video, which was my second playthrough of the American Revolution, that video is really intended to kind of show the results of the second playthrough, where this is an opportunity to look kind of back on it and just kind of talk about how things went as just a separate conversation. If that doesn't interest you, then here's your opportunity to go. But I like doing these because just helps gives some additional space to talk about the campaign, how well I did, and how I think the rules kind of come together to make it all work. Now, in this case, we sort of have had a little bit of time spent doing that in the strategy video that I did a little bit ago before the second playthrough really started. And then all along the other videos covering all the other scenarios. So this one, I'm going to gear towards the second playthrough of the American Revolution scenario, just for the context of the conversation. Um, so I, This is not a review, I should say. This is not a review video. A review is a different style and format of video. The postmortem is not meant to be an assessment of the game itself. But I'll go ahead and be a little spoilery there and just say that, I've genuinely really enjoyed my time with this game. And the American Revolution scenario in particular, it's almost an entirely different game than everything else that we've played in the box or with the expansion content. Just the breadth of everything is very different. The mechanics feel very different. Well, not very different. The mechanics are the same, but just how it all comes together, you're thinking about very different things than many of the other scenarios. The fact that so much is happening in the civilized hexes, the clear hexes, definitely changes the game quite a bit because you're just maneuvering so much more quickly through places where the French and Indian War and a lot of the other scenarios, you're just not doing that as much. So your operational capability to respond to your opponent is just greater, but also still frustrating. um, so a couple other things to talk about here. It feels like holding on to Boston was a good idea until it was a bad idea. And what I mean by that is for sitting on Boston for those couple of years, we kept a lot of American units out of play because a lot of guys come in there, but they also come in on the hexes outside of Boston. But you still control Boston, so that's still all well and good, and kind of control Massachusetts in some ways with control of Boston. Not enough to completely shut it down because there are entry hexes out here for Massachusetts. There's entry hexes for other units in New Hampshire here. So you're always going to have you're always going to have plenty of Patriot activity, American activity around Boston, but you could certainly just kind of sit there. Um, but in the hindsight being, well, if we had pulled those guys out, they could have been reorganized a little bit differently. We just could have picked a different way to operate. And I think that's sort of the key decision you're making. It was a bad idea in the later game because not necessarily because it was bad to be there, but because of what forces were there and just how sensitive they were to being defeated. And the reason why I say that is that, and I'll show you here an example. Here's a whole bunch, and there's more than just these four. I'm just showing these as an example. You can see all these guys start in Boston at the beginning of the game, right? What's special about these? Well, these are British regular regiments that are single step units. And why that's important is that as they are attrited away over time in combats or whatever you're doing with them, let's say you're in combat against the Americans and you suffer two step losses. Well, if the American's going to pick that second step loss, they're probably going to pick the single step British unit. And now that is a British step that is off map, counting towards French entry or the end of the game. Versus, however many other regiments are out there that are two steps, right? You know, the preponderance of single step British units in Boston is a liability. that's where you could attrit them away. And what you would want to be doing to keep those guys safe is to try to keep, um, well, I guess, I mean, you're almost going to lose those guys at some point unless you stick them in Halifax, never to be seen again. And maybe you do that, and you pull that so that out there on the map, in the south or in the north, the British only have two-step British regulars with provincials, Canadian, New Yorker, or otherwise, and then German mercenaries to protect the British steppes. And then I think, maybe that's how you avoid it. Now, we ended up not getting a lot of those single step ones until the late game when that army in Boston was under greater threat over time. That's when we really started to lose those steps. So as the British, you're really just trying to make sure, like, okay, let's minimize the number of two-step combat results we get, period. And then if you are going to get two-step losses, you have, um, all the units that matter in your stack are two-steppers, right? And as soon as you start having single-steppers, you need to start figuring something else out to do with those guys, because the next time you get a two-step result, you're going to lose something. And yeah, when you lose, let's say you had a two-step reduced to a single step, and then this guy gets the target as the second step loss in the combat, yeah, you're going to lose him, and you're going to lose him for good, and that's going to contribute two steps to French entry or whatever. Um, so I think so much of the game's balance uh, is really organized around uh, the French entry versus near economic collapse. Like, that is the fulcrum that the game is balanced against. So in the early game, the British, as they get their reinforcements, are a potent force. And keeping in mind that you can only do like one amphibious invasion a turn, you could still say, like, in a year, you could probably successfully get 3 to 4 pretty good amphibious invasions along the coast somewhere, whether that's in the south or in the north or whatever. And if you've picked a good port to end up in, you pick your readouts, you pick your sort of base of operations in the state. So you get maybe like 2 in the south. Maybe you're lucky and you pick up Savannah by land. Then maybe you take Charleston by sea, or Wilmington by sea, or Bern by sea. Any of these ports. You just need to pick up several of them and do what you can to hold them. Make sure they're well garrisoned. And if you do that, as the British, I think you're in pretty good shape. Like, I think that's sort of goal number one of the British. You got to decide, hold on to Boston or leave it. And then if you leave it and you get all your reinforcements and you sort of set up your army group situation with what units are where and how many steps and whatnot, then you're going to deploy your armies on the coast, pick your ports, and stick in them. I do not see a very good incentive to push inward very far uh, after taking your ports. Now, in the south, there's an incentive. There's an incentive to grab Augusta. You can maybe safely come out to here, which I think this is supposed to be Camden. It's not labeled, but I suppose that's what it's supposed to be. Like, you could, because of the navigable river, you could probably make it out to here if you want to be, because it's a supply hex too. So like, you could do that. I think that one is worth trying for. Trying to come all the way out here feels a little iffy. There's just all this space that could be risky to deal with. So to me, that feels like it's the question. Like, after you make your landings, do you go inward in the south? I don't think it makes much sense to push inward in the north. Um, I don't even know that it makes sense to try to leave New York and do the whole rope a dope with Washington around New Jersey and southern New York, eastern Pennsylvania. I don't know that it makes sense to do that. I think what the British want to do is organize their forces, make sure they're tip-top shape, they're well organized, you know how to absorb losses if you're going to have them, and you will have them, and get situated into the ports, fortify them, get them set up, get under a fortification marker, so you're just going to make it that much harder for the Americans to do anything. As they go through the von Steuben reforms, they're going to get better and better at doing stuff, but you've got time. And you basically just want to use that time to get set up, hopefully recruit some Native American units to kind of help in the backfield and hold steady. As the Americans, if you're in that situation, um, where the British have successfully done that. They made their landings. They're situated in multiple places along the entire coast. They have their own little fortress fortress holdings. What the Americans are going to have to do at that point is, obviously they want to get French entry, but how are you going to do that? The British player is not going to, uh, is unlikely, unless they're foolhardy, they're not going to give you a Saratoga. The British will not do that. They will be ideally much more diligent about making sure that that doesn't happen. Now, the dice always act against you in terms of the activations. You could still end up with somebody hanging out to dry, but if you're not pushing too hard, you're just not going to run into those things, and you're not going to lose as many steps that way. So do the Americans have a solution to that? If the British decide, hey, I've got my ports, we're going to sit tight, we're not going to do anything else, we're not going to push inward, what can the Americans do? Well, they can do something. So I think the solution, or what the American player has to do, if they're not going to get a Saratoga, if they're not going to get a freebie and smash an army, I mean, they should try to look for those opportunities. If they can bait the British out, they should try to do that. If they can't, though, the American is just going to have to come to terms with the fact that they're going to have to force a lot of die rolls. That is what they have to do. And it feels like this isn't even like, I don't want to I don't want to make it seem like, oh, well, you just do this and this is what you have to do, and there's no choice in it. But because there's tactical choice in where you go and where you try and who do you want to put at risk. But I think the general strategy then has to be, if the British are not sticking their chin out, you can't afford to let them do that forever, right? Like you just can't afford to do it. So what you have to do as the Americans is look to where you're getting your reinforcements, look where you got your leaders, do leader redeployments if you have to get a good setup for what you want to accomplish, and then use those leaders, pick up a bunch of units, and just bang your face into the wall of the British fortifications as much as possible, as long as it takes, with whatever you can. Um, that feels very blunt, and it doesn't feel like, is it like, oh, that's a smart strategy, Steve. It is what you have to do. Now, what you have to be smart is, do your stacks that are going to be trying this have artillery? You do get a number of artillery reinforcements over time, so make sure that each stack has one. You don't need more than one, necessarily, unless you're trying to like build up a lot of combat power. But it is actually much more beneficial to have them spread out. You want to have that artillery with a good leader that can do a bonus. So you don't get him until late, but like, uh, DeKalb is great. He activates reasonably often and has a +1. Benedict Arnold, when you eventually get him, is awesome. Uh, Green is okay. He activates a lot, but he's better at defending. And if you're going to be stuck in the situation where you got to bang your head against the wall, it may be better to have a leader that activates less frequently, but has a combat bonus. Not that you have your pick of generals. You just have who you have, and you deal with what you got. Um, but what you want to try to be doing is getting the best modifier you can possibly get, and then just rolling the dice and hoping for the best. But what you're going to try to do when you do that is attrit away the British to some degree over time. You have to be doing step losses to them constantly if you're going to win. And so even, if you're looking at the uh, combat charts, and I'm trying to find, I mean, I guess we could look at the one on the map, but I'd rather just use, yeah, here we go. Like if you look at the combat chart, like if you're rolling on the 1 to 2, let's say you have a -1. Well, if you roll a 6, it's a 5. If you roll a 4 and you got a -1, then it's a 3. And you start to see these defender step losses. Even if you're taking a couple step losses, even if you retreat, The way the movement works is, given, say, a clear hex that you're attacking into, let's say you're adjacent to the port that you're attacking, it might be 1 to enter the port, 5 for combat, 1 to enter the hex, 5 for combat. So 6 movement points. Assume you get the 20 movement points for your activation. You could potentially have 3 different move and attack actions, right? And that's not even counting the multiple rounds of combat that you will probably have. So you're either going to have to force the British to give up their port by evacuating if they place their fleet there, um, or you're just going to get them locked in this set of combats where you're going to start to attrit away their cushion. Now they'll have plenty of cushion, so if you're only able to do 1 step loss to them each combat round, or whenever you can get the combat results, that's still okay. Still do as many step losses as you can, as many. The other thing that you're going to force over time, and this is just the luck of the die, is leader losses. So if you can cause a step loss, he's going to have to roll for leader death or capture or whatever. Now, what can suck is, like, the Americans are just as susceptible, and they're going to be taking a lot more losses, just if they're attacking at bad odds. So be prepared to, monitor the situation if you're not, if you have leaders that are starting to die or be captured. But if you can force that, if you can get lucky and a decent British leader dies, or gets captured or whatever, that's going to help in the long run, because those leaders are going to keep them from being able to react, to activate frequently. If it's a leader with a bonus, now they're that much easier to defeat. And the important thing, even for the German mercenaries, like, okay, you're dealing a step loss, a step loss, a step loss to these German mercenaries. Well, the more that you do, each spring the British only get like 2 steps per spring for mercenary replacements. So as long as you're doing, at least a few steps per turn, you're way overshooting the amount of replacements those German mercenaries are going to get. So it's okay if you're not getting British steps removed as the Americans, as long as you're bleeding somewhere, because eventually, once they run out of a cushion, then you're going to be cutting deep in the blood, and you know that's the, I guess, a pun on the redcoats, but it just, because once they lose the cushion, you're going to very quickly be able to rack up more step losses. So they're going to be, the British might even, like, pull out of a port, because now they're too afraid they're going to lose their cushion, and they're going to give you more stuff, so they leave the port. And in the first couple of years, in 75 and 76, you don't care if they leave the port or not. Like, it doesn't matter, because economic collapse doesn't matter. But if you can force them out of a port before you start counting for port rating, then that is even that much better for you. But you're probably not going to succeed, just due to the lack of the von Steuben reforms. But that's how I think that's what you have to do as the Americans. If the British are doing that, they're not coming out of the cities, they're not putting themselves at risk of a Saratoga. You got to take the fight to them, and you just have to bash your head in the wall. Take a leader, run back, pick up a bunch of units, come back, maybe attack just once, but get it so that you're able to just keep attacking. And this gets into the thing with the way the combat factors work for American units. So, here are 2 regiments. They defend together with 8 factors. If they attack, you put 8 together, you divide it in half, they attack with 4, right? Well, okay, let's say they attack and they take a step loss, okay? Well, now they defend at a 6, which is, not as good, but let's say we had a second round of combat, in linear combat. Well, what's their attack value? Half of 4 is 2, plus a non-box factor of 2 is 4. So they've taken a step loss, but their attack factors are the same. And that's the advantage of the American forces, that the way that the math works, and this was all intentional, I'm sure, in the design, you can go for combat, and what will eventually start to happen is, if you've got enough of these units and you're only taking a step loss, you could take 10 step losses. If you have 10 regiments in a stack and you take 10 step losses over the course of a turn, but they're all in 1-step increments, your attack value might not change very much at all. So you could be rolling a 1-to-1 combat repeatedly, even taking a step loss here, a step loss there. Um, and then meanwhile, if the British are taking any step losses, their defense factors are probably dropping by 2 or 3 every step. And you can eventually start getting better odds on the chart, which will lead to better results, more consistent results. And that's where you start to kind of shift the game back in your favor as the Americans. Um, so that's like to me, that's like the early game stuff. When you get to the mid game, I think that's the critical point. I think 1777 and 1778 are obviously the very critical years because it's going to come down to which happens first. Does French entry happen first, or does economic collapse happen first? And I can see why the short scenario victory conditions are in the scenario book there because I could definitely see like that's gonna be what decides the game. If near economic collapse happens before French entry, um, it's going to be very difficult for the Americans to kind of dig themselves out of the unit hole that when they lose all those units. And then for a period of time, the British are going to have a tremendous advantage, even more than they already did, because once near economic collapse occurs, the American forces are so diluted on the map that you can start as the British to exit your ports and have much more territorial command over the map. You can make much more progress because there's less guys to get in your way. So if you cause near economic collapse to the Americans and you've avoided French entry, I would even extend an offer to your American opponent and say, hey, do you just want to call it a victory? Because I think it would be that much harder, to be honest. You could probably play it out some more and just see what happens because if you're already doing that well that you got near economic collapse and the French don't come in and you play one more year, you're probably going to have full economic collapse if the French have not come in at that point. Um, so it's really going to come down to like, can you make it happen? Are you close enough to French entry to keep going? Now, if you get French entry first before near economic collapse, the die roll modifier, like, it's so funny. Like the French, in other American Revolution games, I'll just say, like, French entry is cool. Like you usually withdraw a few British units, and then you get Rochambeau at some point, and that's kind of it. And maybe you get the French fleet, and that's cool. I think the most powerful thing about French entry in this game is the die roll modifier for economic collapse. Like that -2 is so critical during 78 and 79. It is going to drive the entire rest of the game. That -2, super duper important because it's going to nullify what the British probably have as the plus bonus to that die roll. And if you don't have French entry, then you're going to look at collapse pretty easily. If you have French entry and you have that support, then you stand a pretty good chance of staving off near economic collapse for another year or even 2 years. And I think if the Americans have 2 years where they get all of their units replenished and they're on the attack consistently, they can wear the British down. And then obviously with French entry in West Indies withdrawal, you have those handful of turns where it's like, oh well, the British can only do so much, and then they lose a bunch of guys. And it does feel like, until the West Indies withdraw and they lose what their 18 steps of units or whatever, which comes out to be quite a number of combat factors, no matter which way you do it. Um, that gives the advantage to the Americans, right? So both sides have this sort of political event that draws off a ton of their forces. And if you can avoid yours and cause your opponents to happen, um, you're going to have a tremendous advantage through the rest of the game. So imagine that, you don't have near economic collapse for a long time, maybe if at all. I'm not sure how likely that is. I think eventually it's bound to happen. But let's say it happens late. Let's say you get that French entry early. Yeah, the British are heavily weakened. The Americans can have their full complement of Continentals, and they can continuously wear down the British, especially after the withdrawal happens. The adverse being they don't have to withdraw for the West Indies withdrawals, and the French are not there, and the Americans lose half their army in the near economic collapse. Well, then the British can come out of the ports at that point. They can defeat the much smaller American armies, and then they can start spreading out, occupying entry hexes. They might. I would even suggest that they look at what units are on the board and which entry hexes matter, in case there are some that are no longer relevant because the only units that enter there are the NEC units. Then they can come out safely. They can blanket occupy territory. They can restore British colonial government rule to the states and all of that. That is when it can happen. That's when it's more reasonable if they turn that advantage. And then they get all those extra reinforcements in the late stage of the game if the French have not entered, which to me really puts the nail in the coffin. So I definitely, like, makes total sense for the short scenario. Like, if you can't get the French to enter by a certain time, yeah, that if the French are going to enter and you're in that position, you might need to call the game early for the British at that point. In this second playthrough that I did, they both happened at different times, and that meant that the game stayed more even through to the end, where, yeah, the British lost a bunch of their army to the withdraw, the Americans lost a bunch of their army due to not being able to pay their guys, and then it remained a tighter contest with, the hope that the Americans weren't going to have a full collapse, and the British were focused on kind of different things. So that kind of brings me to late game. As it relates to the late game, I think the game is going to be, it shifts quite a bit. But just assuming, like, okay, early game again is, do the British leave or stay in Boston? And then are they able to take ports along the coast to be their bases of operation? That's early game. Mid game is then all around whether or not near economic collapse occurs or French entry occurs. If one happens without the other, then you might be able to say, hey, the game's could be called maybe at that point, depending on the sequence of events. But the mid game is very interesting. And then the late game, I think you only have the late game if both players have suffered their bad event. The French have entered, and so we have West Indies withdrawal, but near economic collapse occurs or is about to occur, and the Americans have lost half of their army. So each side has now become much reduced in capability, though the Americans still enjoy certain advantages along the way. If you're in the late game, right, then the strategy comes down to staving off full economic collapse. The rest of the game is going to be based around that at that point. Because I still don't see it as likely that the British would restore British colonial government rule in the colonies. In fact, I would guarantee that nobody is going to win the American Revolution scenario via that victory condition. I just don't see it happening. What you have to have already have pretty much won the game and are likely causing full economic collapse by the time you would have restored colonial rule in every state. So just assume that, like, that's not even realistic. It's there, it's written in the rule book, but you're never going to achieve it. So the late game is all about full economic collapse, and the Americans keeping that from happening, and then being able to force the fall of Lord North's government by bloodying the British, whatever remnant exists, by the late game, and however many steps are there. So there is the long game of trying to keep British steps from being eliminated. But if you're in the late game, what you probably want to be doing as the British is to not have too many spread out armies in the late game after you have the West Indies withdrawal. What you probably need to be doing is consolidating several of your stacks, very likely giving up ports to do it, so that you have strong armies that can operate well on the coast. And you're no longer caring necessarily about holding the ports. If you can hold a port safely, you should do that, like New York. Maybe you've dug in somewhere in Charleston. But what you want to make sure you're doing is picking a robust stack and have them on a raiding mission to raid coasts, raid ports that you probably can't hold, but just running through them and eliminating, like, one unit and then keep moving if you can, to jack up that raid calculation, so that if you're holding New York, if you're holding one or two other ports, and then you're getting a bunch of raids accomplished, that you increase the likelihood that you're going to cause full economic collapse, and that's a victory condition. the Americans are obviously going to need to contest that. So having reaction forces doing everything they can to delay the British action, as well as trying to find those opportunities to continue to bleed off British forces, making use of the American light infantry. They're very potent. I didn't think they were going to be as potent as they were, but you're basically getting extra combat power for a step, and you're never going to take your first step losses on these light infantry, so they're just adding extra firepower to a stack. And if you put a lot of them all in one stack, you're boosting a single army quite a bit. So you're using them to try to wear down the British, and then when Rochambeau comes on, if you've made it to the late game and he enters, you can send Rochambeau somewhere, either to take a port back or maybe to find a good place where there's a weakened army that can't sustain intense combat with a decent leader. And then the other big thing is the French fleet. So in my second playthrough, the French fleet like won 3 naval battles against the British. It was crazy. I was surprised every time it happened, but I mean it's just a straight up die roll, so I guess I shouldn't be that surprised. But when you can get the fleet into the sea area, you're effectively blocking evacuation. You're making it harder for them to remain in supply. And if you can catch the British, historically it was Yorktown, which feels like you're never going to fall into that trap. There's plenty of places along the coast where you can make it really hard for the British to successfully get away, and keep them hemmed in. And then if you can hit them with winter attrition, that could be the difference that gives you the game and causes the fall of the British government, and win you the game. So the late game has a very different, nuance to it, that what you're trying to achieve is now very different. It's very much around keeping the British from being able to raid, and it's about trying to pinpoint places where you can pin something with the French fleet, assuming you get it. Now the Spanish are a factor. It feels like a gimme because the Spanish army is pretty potent. So assuming you have French entry, then you get Spanish entry. They pick up Natchez. That gives you an extra, uh, but bonus, or I guess penalty, but beneficial to the Americans on the economic collapse roll. That can help keep you alive a little bit longer, to reach those 35 steps of British regulars lost off map. So there's a compared to other scenarios, you can tell this scenario is much meatier. There's a whole flow of the scenario as it goes as time goes on, and generally I've had a pretty good time with it. So I don't know, just some more thoughts on that. I mean, I think there's definitely some traps you can get yourself stuck in New England. So yeah, New England's kind of tricky. Given the number of reinforcements that come in here, though, I do think it's a risk management decision if you want the British to operate well in here. Because if you can clog up Connecticut and you can clog up some of these other entry hexes, that is so many reinforcements, strong reinforcements for the Americans that they would not get. And I do think that's a value, though, obviously there's a lot of risk there, and it comes down to timing. Is the militia available? That's going to slow you down. But if you get a turn where the militia is gone, and maybe there's only a handful of units here, that's when you go on a rampage and you try to knock it all out in one turn, or garrison it all in one turn, and then uh, that keeps the militia from coming back, and you've shut down a lot of reinforcements for the next spring turn. So there's definitely a lot of elements there that matter. Um, but okay, guys, I think that's enough talking on this one. Had a lot of fun with it. I do recommend this. I think for anyone who's purchased this game and has only stuck their toe in the water with the smaller scenarios or the French and Indian War scenario, please give this one a try, and maybe give it 2, because you're going to learn a lot along the way. But maybe these videos will help you have a good time right off the bat, and you've learned from all that I've now learned from the game. So, all right, thanks for watching, guys. We'll see you in the next video. Probably will be a review here very soon. But until then, take care. Keep on gaming.